Sports Talk Chicago. Cover Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's a Fox Sports broadcaster, senior baseball writer at Sports Illustrated, and an MLB Network Insider. Please welcome Tom Verducci to the program. Tom, it's great to have you on. How are you?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
So, Tom, what's your reaction to the baseball lockout, first off?
Well, it did feel inevitable. You always hold out hope and you want to be optimistic, but I did think it felt inevitable over the course of the last few months because there really hadn't been much progress at all. And even though the CBA ran out, I don't think it was considered a real hard deadline, because usually things happen in baseball when there's a real deadline. And I think because there's no games, because players aren't getting paid this time of year, it didn't create the sense of urgency that a lot of us as fans would like to have seen, where they felt like there was pressure to get a deal. So it was a sad day. It felt kind of like the last day of school when it came around, but it was not totally unexpected.
What's the main point of contention right now?
Well, I would say the main point of contention is that the owners are pretty happy with the status quo and are willing to make tweaks to the system, whereas the players really want major changes to the system. So that, to me, that's where a really big divide is here. For instance, the players want to at least talk about changing three, I consider, pillars of the last few CBAs: free agency, arbitration, and revenue sharing. Now, in the past, we've had strikes over one of those issues, arbitration in particular. So trying to change three of the pillars in one CBA negotiation is going to be really hard, and it's going to take a long time. So, we saw all the money spent right before the deadline came, before the CBA expired, and we're asking ourselves as fans, well, it seems like there's a lot of money going around, but it's really it's really the distribution of it. Players want teams to be as competitive as they are, which means every year you're trying to win. You're trying to do the best that you can to win, while the owners, this really goes back to sort of the influx of analytics in the game and using data, have, under the influence of presidents and analytics departments, have realized, you know what, it really doesn't make sense to spend money if you're a 72-win team to try to get those incremental wins to get to 75. Let's retrench and really build up our farm system so that when we are ready to win, then we'll spend. So that's a big philosophical divide, that players want a say in how teams are spending money. And the owners obviously don't want to give in that regard when it comes to revenue sharing.
How do you think this whole thing gets resolved?
Well, to me, the harder deadline, the one that actually puts some pressure here into talks and forcing a compromise, is losing anything on the field. And I would say spring training as well. I mean, obviously, you don't want to lose any regular season games, but if you back it up, spring training has to be a minimum of 3 weeks. And so that pushes things to the end of February, early March, where I think that's when you're talking about really having a lot of pressure to get a deal done. So I couldn't tell you where exactly the negotiations will wind up going in terms of where that compromise is. For instance, free agency, players want to knock that down from 6 to 5 for certain players. 6 years service time has been there since 1976. That seems like a no-fly zone for the owners. They don't seem to be engaged in that at all. So it's hard to see right now where the final landing point is, that there's room for compromise. But I just have to believe that there's so much at stake if there is any kind of a stoppage that takes the game off the field when it's supposed to be on the field. This is very different from the world we lived in 1990 and 95. There's so many more options for fans now. And obviously we're coming off this, and still are, in the pandemic, where we had this shortened season in 2020. So to me, the risk of shutting the game down even for a shorter period of time is far greater than it was in 1990 and 1995.
Tom Verducci here on Sports Talk Chicago. Tom, how different could the game look after this? Like, could we see some rule changes thrown into this CBA too?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I understand as a union, they're fighting for the best economic deal they can. And those issues that we talked about are huge. But when I look at the game as a whole, I think the biggest problem in the game right now and the future of the game is all about the pace of the game. That has to be addressed. I mean, baseball is doing something that is antithetical to what we all live in this really crowded entertainment landscape. And that is, baseball is trying to ask people to invest more time and see less action. That's the complete inverse of where everything else in this world is going. That has to be addressed. And I think if you want to see the future of baseball, what it should look like, watch an Arizona Fall League game. They have the pitch clock there. You can give me this same game with all the 3 true outcomes, a ton of strikeouts. But if you play that game at a quicker pace, and I'll give you a time of game just as an example, although pace is more important. Say it takes 2:40 instead of 3:05 to play the exact same game. Baseball is in a much better spot. The game has to move quicker. Now, so far, these issues are being pushed to the side because the labor issues on the economics are just so difficult for them to tackle. They really haven't been able to dive into these things. We've seen some of these things tried in the Arizona Fall League, but there does need to be some agreement with the players to make this game look better. I do think the game will look different next year. How so exactly? Maybe there's universal DH. There's a lot of talk about that. Expanded playoffs. Maybe there's things that you can tweak the schedule somehow to change some of that. But as far as the product on the field, I'm a big proponent in having a pitch clock. I hope that's in play. There's talk about the shift. I would not mind seeing a governor on shifts. I think the pitch clock, though, is if you gave me one thing to do, that's the magic wand to wave. It's the one thing that's guaranteed to make the game look different immediately. And yeah, players might carp about it for a month or two, but we saw this with the slide rule at second base, the no collisions at home plate. Players adjust. And now we're at a point now where 3/4 of the players in the major leagues have already played with a pitch clock. They've come up through the minor leagues with a pitch clock. We're not asking them to do something they haven't been through before. But they haven't shown on the major league level real appetite for that. But somebody has to be convinced, other than me, because I don't make these decisions, that is the biggest issue in baseball. It's been kicked down the road far too long. It needs to be addressed now.
How do you feel about expanded playoffs?
I'm okay with it. I mean, I think probably the better compromise is going from 5 to 6 or 7 teams. And we probably had too many in 20, but that was a function of the shorter season. I don't have a problem with that. I mean, kind of that best of 3 first round series is kind of interesting to me. I happen to like the 1-game wild card. It creates a lot of pressure on managers. And I love it when managers get nervous and they complain that they're putting their season on the line in one game. That makes it more exciting, right? But the best out of 3 is not bad. I mean, as long as you don't add so many extra days in the calendar, because right now you don't need more extra days in the postseason calendar. The inventory of the games is large enough. What people want to see is games that are deciding games, potential deciding games. So best 2 out of 3, you may have the 1 game where it's not deciding, but I kind of like the idea. It's a different world we live in now. Some people still cling to this idea that the best team ought to win the World Series every year. I mean, that hasn't been true since baseball expanded back in the early 60s. This is the world we live in sports, that the postseason is a second season. The best team doesn't always win. It's usually the hottest team and sometimes the luckiest team. So I think it's good. It's good for the players because, listen, the reason they play this game is to get a chance to win wear that ring. And this gives more players a chance for that.
What do you think hurts the game of the new proposals you've seen? Something you don't like?
Well, I'm not sure about moving the mound back, a foot. It doesn't make a really big difference when you think about it percentage wise. But my theory on that is, yeah, I know they talk about velocity and it's gone up a lot, and it gives hitters that fraction of a second longer to see the ball. But you're also creating more movement. The breaking pitches move more. And I tell people, as much as we talk about velocity in the game today, it's really spin that is making the game so difficult for hitters. You could take a high velocity fastball, I'm talking 95 and above, and that's still easier to hit for hitters than an average breaking ball, or sometimes even a bad breaking ball. So I'm not sure if that's going to get anything done in terms of getting more balls in play. I don't know how you retrofit all the mounds across the country as well. I'd rather have guys growing up in college and high school with the same mound, so there's no adjustment. Some of these rules about a limited pickoffs to first base, I just don't think that works at all. I like the fact, though, they're thinking about these things, and in these Petri dishes and the independent ball and AFL, we're starting to see it play out. Some work, some don't. But I would think about the shift and what the answer is. I'm not sure whether you have to be on the dirt or even if you just have 2 people on each side of the base, you can play as deep as you want. I don't have a problem with that because I think that actually shows off the athleticism on the field where now range becomes super important. And I don't know about you, but I get tired of watching guys just absolutely smoke a ball 200 feet to right field and they get thrown out by the second baseman who's playing the rover position. It just doesn't seem fair to me. I think anything we can do that generate a little more offense would really help. I don't think it's going to be a real big impact on the game. I really don't, but it will help, especially against left-handed hitters who are not that fast, where they can flex the defense so deep.
What about the argument that guys could just bunt against the shift? Why does no one bunt against the shift?
That's a great question, because we all sit there in the stands and the field is open to us and we can see that. It looks like an easy hit, right? Just do it. The problem is guys can't do it because they can't do it because they don't practice it. And I'm amazed that more players haven't really made that a part of their arsenal. Go to spring training, go on a backfield and drop 100 bunts a day. I mean, it is a single waiting to happen. Listen, 2 outs, bases empty, you have some pop, you shouldn't be bunting. I get that. But there's certain points of the game, especially leading off down by multiple runs, where they're giving you that hit, you should be able to drop it. But guys they literally can't do it, a lot of these hitters. So it's like Jim Leland told me a long time ago, as a manager, your job is one of the big keys. Don't ask players to do what they can't do. So I wish it was emphasized more by the teams to have these players bunt. That's my biggest reason why I would say most guys don't do it, because they can't do it.
Tom Verducci here on Sports Talk Chicago. Tom, what do you make of the Marcus Stroman signing for the Cubs?
I like it a lot. Marcus has been really durable when you look at, the health of his arm and elbow. It's the first thing I always look at with pitchers as they get around 29, 30. Super tough competitor. You love the compete factor you see in Marcus Stroman. Doesn't back down, wants the ball in big spots. It's I think a really good signing. When you have pitchers like Stroman and Hendricks, though, and in general, the Cubs staff that puts the ball in play, you better have a good defense. And, that's really what the Cubs have to prioritize here. It's sort of like the Cardinals model. The Cardinals are an unbelievable defensive team. And they need to be, because their staff is not a strikeout staff. They've kind of zigged when everybody else has zagged, throwing a lot of sinkers. So that's Marcus Stroman. He's going to put the ball on the ground more than half the time. I like the fact that, even if you don't want to qualify him as a number one stuff-wise, he thinks he's a number one, which is a really cool thing, that, he wants the ball in big spots. So I like the signing. I got to be honest with you. I didn't see it coming. I'm not sure Jed Hoyer saw it coming, to be honest with you. My analogy was, it's like when you hear a forecast for a big snowstorm, just hearing the forecast, everybody runs out to the hardware store to get some snow shovels and rock salt, right? And they get wiped out of it. I think that's what happened with Jed Hoyer on the starting pitching market. Like, I don't think teams anticipated the run on free agents, especially starting pitchers, but it did happen. And then you realize, wait a second, I got to go to plan B. Even if Jed wasn't thinking about jumping up for Stroman this early in the winter, I think he's almost forced to, because everybody was buying snow shovels. You got to get one of your own.
How do you interpret the move? Like, are the Cubs going to be contending this year? Or is this just kind of like a depth kind of signing?
Yeah, this comes out of that category of wait and see. I agree. It's tough to read just on the signing in and of itself. Listen, I think it's a good enough contract, good enough pitcher. I think it makes sense no matter where a team is on the winning curve. But for a team that lost 91 last year, you do have to consolidate it with other moves. And again, I really look at the defense behind him, and that's going to be super important. Listen, if you wanted to play this out to, what the fan would love to see, a guy like Carlos Correa is perfect for the Chicago Cubs. Platinum glove defender last year. What I loved about Correa, too, is he's always been a good player, but he's been healthy the last couple of years. And more importantly for me, he reduced his strikeout rate and increased his walk rate to career highs. So you're looking at a guy who's getting better, really invested in making himself better, even though, as I said, he was a good player already. So, listen, that's the top of the market, though. And none of us saw the Cubs shopping at the top of the market. I don't see it happening unless somehow the market just doesn't develop to what Carlos's true value is. But I'll be interested to see where the Cubs go from here in terms of following up the Stroman signing.
How close are they to being contenders again?
It's a really good question. I mean, to me, it looks like it's at least 2 years away. And again, this is going to depend on how quickly they want to reinvest money. We talked about where teams are in the winning curve. I'm not sure where the Cubs sort of do that self-analysis to say, for instance, again, Correa, does it make sense now to shorten the timeline? Because you're talking about a guy who's still young. And obviously, no matter what their curve is, he's going to be around the next time the Cubs have a championship caliber team. but I'm not sure if they see it as that quick. I mean, there's a lot of teams now. Not everybody's able to turn these things around quickly. I mean, the Philadelphia Phillies have tried, haven't been able to do it. Now you have the Tigers look like they're making some headway. When we talk about when they're ready to contend again, not everybody does it like the 16 Cubs and the 17 Astros, where it's able to turn around as quickly as it did.
Tom Verducci, still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Tom, a few more questions before we finish out. First off, your Hall of Fame ballot. What's it looking like this year? What are you thinking about?
I haven't even opened the envelope yet. I've tried not to think about it. I mean, obviously, there's the guys who've been on the ballot. I've done all that homework, have my track record. Anybody can look it up and who I vote for and who I don't. But as far as the new guys go, I haven't yet really dove into the numbers. And I like to really set aside like a weekend just to get away from any other responsibilities and really just dive into some of the numbers. I like doing my own things. I'll read other things as well, but it's a difficult ballot. It always is. It seems like it's been difficult now every year for the last decade as we came out of the steroid era. I like to say, though, there's no right and wrong answers. As long as people do their homework and they have a reason for why they're voting, that's what's great about this process. We have 500 plus people voting, especially writers. They're not going to agree on anything. I know that. And that 75% threshold is so high. I think it's become harder. Usually I had a really good feel for how these things were going to turn out. And I got to be honest with you, I think it's harder and harder. Like last year, I thought Curt Schilling was going in. I thought he was getting over the line and he came close, but he didn't. So predicting where it winds up, it's getting harder and harder.
Will the guys you voted for last year most likely stay on the ballot this year for you?
Yeah, I don't know that I've voted for somebody and then not voted for them. I'd have to think about that, but I don't think about that. I don't think I've done so off the top of my head. Now, I have changed my no's to yeses. I have done that. And again, people say, "Oh, how could that happen?" I mean, the guy doesn't have any more wins, doesn't have any more hits. How does his candidacy get better? Well, I'm not going to pretend like I get it perfectly right the first time somebody's on a ballot. You're open to other people's impressions, and yeah, I think sometimes I am convinced the more information I get, kind of reassess people. I'm glad that guys are on the ballot for 10 years, and especially glad that we have that 5-year waiting period. Sort of takes the emotion out of it, if you will. But it's funny that with steroids, the emotions still seem to be there for a lot of people.
How do you feel about steroid users in Cooperstown?
Well, for me, I tried to come up with sort of a policy, if you will, that to me most fits what I would do as a journalist. So for me, when it comes to players using steroids, and this would apply to not just the Hall of Fame ballot, but in general, if I was writing a story, I needed some proof that to me stands up to public scrutiny that a person did use steroids. So in other words, people a lot of times back in the day said, "You guys in the media were complicit." Well, not really, because you just can't write based on rumor and innuendo, and there were a ton of them, that this guy is on steroids, or that he had hit 15 more home runs or put on 20 pounds, so he must be on steroids. Fans can do that, I get it, but as a journalist you should have a higher standard than that. So for me, that when I look at the Hall of Fame ballot, if there is proof that the player used steroids, then I won't vote for that player, no matter whether it happened before testing or after testing. Every player who made that decision realized they knew it was not the right decision. In a legal sense, they were federally controlled substances. And from a competitive sense, I mean, I think the basic thing you're charged with as an athlete, amateur or professional, is play the game fairly. And steroids created an uneven playing field. And when I look at a ballot, I always think about some of the players I talked to in the early 2000s who were playing the game clean and felt really disadvantaged. They felt either they had to sacrifice their own moral compass and use steroids just to keep up with someone, or they had to play the game at a disadvantage. So I always remember those players. And so that's been my policy, that I just can't endorse anybody who made that part of their career, whether it was early in their career or later in their career.
How do you feel about David Ortiz? Is his case different than someone like Barry Bonds or Alex Rodriguez?
Yeah, it is different. It's actually different from anything that I've come across, because there has been a report about him failing a supposedly anonymous survey testing in 2003, but the substance was never identified, never confirmed. In fact, both the Players Association and the Commissioner of Baseball went out of their way to exonerate Ortiz as far as that qualifying as a positive test. I don't think there's been anything like that. So it is a different case. I'm going to go back and really rethink this one hard, whether that in fact should be counted as proof positive that David Ortiz used steroids. It's a really interesting question. It's not an easy one, I'll be honest with you, for anybody who, whatever your stand is on steroids, to just say, yeah, David Ortiz is no, or David Ortiz, I don't care. But did David Ortiz use steroids? It's not as black and white as some of the other cases.
Do you think, obviously, with the numbers he has, he should be in, right? Numbers just by.
Yeah, I do. Listen, his numbers as a DH are incredible. I know it's a little harder for DHs to get in, but I also think about the fame aspect of the ballot. David Ortiz changed history. And I said the same thing about Curt Schilling and some of the games that he pitched. Curt Schilling was one of the biggest big game pitchers, at least of our generation, and helped decide championships. And certainly is the case for David Ortiz with all the clutch hits he made in the postseason. Now, you're not going to get into the Hall of Fame just on a few clutch hits in the postseason. David Freese, I love him, but he's not a Hall of Famer. But when you combine that, it's almost like getting extra credit on a high school test. You can get extra credit big time when you change baseball history. And I think guys like Ortiz and Schilling did.
And Tom, before we finish up today, last question. How'd it feel to find out that your uncle Gil Hodges made the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, that was really cool because the first person I thought about was Joan Hodges, his widow, who's 95 years old, lives in the same house that they lived in Brooklyn all those years. So you think about, well, no one had ever gotten closer to the Hall of Fame than Gil Hodges without getting in. And for me, it is personal. I mean, I was my first game was at Yankee Stadium between the Senators and the New York Yankees because Gil Hodges was manager of the Senators at the time. And I remember going out to the team bus after the game, got the really good access because of Uncle Gil. And I remember looking up at Frank Howard playing on the Senators, and I swore he was as big as the bus, which is pretty close to being true, by the way. And then Gil Hodges gets traded to the Mets, becomes the manager, and my brothers and I all became Mets fans. So, as a kid growing up and seeing the 69 Mets win the World Series, and that's my uncle managing the team. I mean, I loved baseball anyway, but that really hooked me to go through that October and the Miracle Mets and the ride that they were on. So it's been a long time coming. I'm happy to see it. I'm really happy for Jim Cott, my colleague at MLB Network. Happy certainly for Buck O'Neil and Minnie Minoso. And those guys in particular, I thought it was really fascinating that they got in because they're sort of, baseball lifers who gave so much to the game. So you can look at their playing careers. Obviously, they were on the writer's ballot and didn't get in and say they come up short. But when you think about everything they've done for the game, Minnie Minoso, Gil Hodges, and Jim Cott, and Buck O'Neil dedicated their lives to baseball and in very accomplished ways. Some of the greatest ambassadors that we've known in the game, especially Buck O'Neil. So I'm really happy that the Hall kind of acknowledged that being a Hall of Famer means more than just what your WAR is in your playing career. And, hopefully that opens the door a little wider for some of these people that really are icons and legends in the game of baseball. So again, my first thought, it still is really about Joan Hodges, just so happy for her and what the family's gone through with so many close calls over the years. I think they had almost given up hope, but it's just so happy to see for the whole family that it finally came true.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. Best wishes covering this lockout and with the Hall of Fame ballot. I don't envy your position, but I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. This is fun. Thanks.